Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the second part of our two-day seminar on US policy towards Asia in Donald Trump's second term. We had an excellent day yesterday focusing on India, China, and Central Asia, and today we move to other parts of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. We are delighted to be hosting this event in collaboration with the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office Association in the UK and the International Institute for Asian Studies in the Netherlands. And it's a pleasure to have such diverse collaborators. The IIAS is very much an academic institution, the FCDOA very much one of practitioners of, well, diplomacy and development. So different ranges of views there. For those that aren't familiar with the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, we were founded in 1901, initially focusing on Central Asia and expanding our remit in subsequent years. We publish a journal, Asian Affairs, edited by Bill Hayton, who is moderating the first of this morning's sessions. And if you would like to receive it regularly, you can do so by joining the RSAA, and I encourage you to go to our website and do just that. For the moment, though, I would like simply to welcome in person Martina from the IIAS and give her the chance to introduce herself and the organization. I hope you enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for this introduction. I would like to thank first the Royal Society for Asian Affairs and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office Association for this great initiative. I think it's a great conference, and I heard there was already a good exchanges yesterday, so I hope there will be also fruitful exchanges this afternoon. My name is Martina van den Haak, and I'm an Institute Manager at the International Institute for Asian Studies. Unfortunately, our director had to attend another meeting, so could not be here. So I'm just replacing him during this meeting. The IIS is based at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and for more than 3 decades already. We're a platform that actually builds knowledge communities in a collaborative approach, and we're facilitating exchanges and connecting people. Originally, we were more indeed an academic institute, like Michael explained, but over the years, I think we expanded our reach because besides the academic connections we have, we try to connect to different stakeholders all over the world. So we're working together with artists, practitioners, governments, municipalities, local communities, NGOs. So there's quite a diverse range of stakeholders that we're working together with. And besides the different stakeholders, we also work inter and intra-regional. So although in our name, it's the Asian Studies Institute. Asia is always an entry point, but in our work, we work together like on, in, and with Asia. So one example is, for example, we're hosting the Africa-Asia Conference Festival, which was taking place for the 3rd time in Senegal. So this is also about relations and connections and also differences between Africa and Asia. Let me think. We have 5 core priorities. So the first one is research and knowledge facilitation. The second one is education innovation. The third one is knowledge sharing. The fourth is civic engagement. And the fifth one is the capacity and the network building. So we have actually a very large network in different places. And we do that actually through different instruments. So for example, we publish the newsletter, which is a periodical which is available in hard copy and online, and you can subscribe for free to it. So please do so if you're interested. And that covers different developments within the Asian studies, reviews, different things that happen in the network. So it may be of interest to you. Besides that, there is the conference festival. So these are the International Convention of Asia Scholars and the Africa-Asia conferences. And it's not purely an academic conference, but we try to connect to the local place by working together also with the municipalities, museums, local communities, artists, for example. So the last one, the ICAS one, took place in Surabaya in 2024, and we're now exploring for a new partner. So in Surabaya, Indonesia, the whole city was kind of part of this conference. Besides that, we also have some other network initiatives like the Humanities Across Borders and also the River City Network that have also, again, many partners that we work with in different places in the world. I think, there's also like publications, outreach initiatives, etc. But if you're interested in collaborating with us, please reach out, because we're always interested to expand further our network and initiatives. So I think because time is going fast, so I would like to hand over the floor to Charlie, and I would like to wish you a very interesting and fruitful afternoon with all the different presentations and exchanges.
First panel today is looking at Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia's economic dynamism and strategic location make it a linchpin of the Indo-Pacific. Yet for Washington, the region represents both opportunity and challenge, an arena where nations seek to balance relations with the US and China through pragmatic hedging. Trump's second administration faces questions about the credibility of American engagement with ASEAN, the future of US technology and innovation partnerships, and the direction of key bilateral relationships, from Vietnam to Indonesia. This panel will assess how US policy responds to the region's fast-evolving political and economic realities. Can Washington craft a vision that aligns security commitments and development goals with digital transformation? And will Southeast Asia continue to see the US as a reliable long-term partner? To help us answer these questions, we have a fantastic panel with us to start off today's session, moderated by Dr. Bill Hayton. Bill is an Associate Fellow with the Asia Pacific Programme at Chatham House and the editor of the RSAA's journal Asian Affairs. He's a former BBC journalist who has worked across the world, spending time as the BBC correspondent in Vietnam and embedded with the state broadcaster of Myanmar. He's also the author of 4 books covering China, Vietnam, and the South China Sea. In the second half of the panel, there'll be time for questions, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask questions. But without any further ado, I'll hand over to Bill.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Charlie, and welcome to everybody watching. I'm really pleased to be joined by Anne-Marie Murphy and by Prashanth Parameswaran. The 3 of us are based in Southeast Asia right now, and Prashanth is in Washington, DC. And so I guess we're quite well balanced to have a discussion about Trump 2 and Southeast Asia. I guess maybe every different part of the Asian region will say it's had, plenty of practice at balancing between the US and China, but somehow it always feels more urgent in Southeast Asia, maybe because China is so close and the US has played such a strong role in Southeast Asian history in recent decades. So shall we begin? Sort of Prashanth, where would you be happy to kick off maybe and talk about how things appear to be progressing from the Washington end? Sometimes these days it feels like Southeast Asia is much more stable than Washington. I don't know how kind of things seem to change from day to day. But do you want to give us a sort of overview, maybe, and just what do you think that the Trump administration is up to? What it sees its priorities, and does it think things are going very well at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And thanks to you and Charlie for the invitation. And it's great to be here with you as well as Anne-Marie and Elina as well. I think, if I were to kind of summarize how the administration's approach is going now, I think the tagline that the Trump administration was kind of trumpeting to the rank and file individuals, including diplomats and so on and so forth, was, everything that the United States needs to do from now on is not going to be what it was like before in terms of general interests. This whole thing about Southeast Asia being the third largest population center in the world and, the fifth largest economy and so on and so on and so forth. We need to be thinking only about what is making America more safer, more secure, and more prosperous. And I think, I got a WhatsApp message from one of the US diplomats from the region sort of saying, well, what the bleep do they think we were doing before, right? And so I think there is a recognition among the rank and file that to what extent does this actually change? And to what extent is this actually continuity with what US policy was before? And to the extent that everything is based on what is going to make the United States more safer, secure, and more prosperous, that's presumably what everyone in Southeast Asia and everyone globally wants to do anyway. So to what extent does that actually align with the interests of these individual countries in that respect? And I think you saw this a little bit in what happened with the Trump administration's engagements in Southeast Asia most recently. So I was in Malaysia right before the summit, about a week or two, and I think there were still some questions about what the scheduling would be, whether some of the deals would come through. But I would say in terms of the Trump administration's engagement in ASEAN itself, they were very much focused in terms of making this a kind of deal-making hub. So they wanted to use ASEAN and the engagements in Malaysia as a way to kind of get some initial deals and get some other Southeast Asian countries to come on board. So the fact that they got some deals on board with Cambodia and Malaysia, at least some sort of framework on the table for a couple of other countries, talked about scam centers, and then Hexet went on his trip and essentially concluded a defense agreement with Malaysia, which is basically an updating of what they've done before, ended up in a few other stops as well, including Vietnam and Southeast Asia. It means that the administration has kind of kicked off its policy. But I think there's a lot of questions about how this fits into an overall strategy. I mean, everything we've seen from what the administration has talked about in some of its briefings is, a more focus on the Indo-Pacific is still being prioritized, but there's going to be a little bit more of a rebalancing on the hemispheric and homeland front. And that means very different things for each individual Southeast Asian country. And then where do each of these individual countries fit within the ASEAN context in terms of the stronger, safer, more prosperous notion? Now, the joint vision statement that was adopted between the United States and ASEAN, it's a very short document. It's about 2.5 pages, and all it says is the US and ASEAN are going to work to make each other more secure, safer, and more prosperous. And that's about it. So I think the question here is, where did these countries fit into these individual buckets? I think it's very easy to say on the US front, from looking at it from a US perspective, if you're talking about stronger, the Philippines is essential for any Taiwan scenario. So that's almost a separate bilateral track. But beyond that, it's very difficult to see what the US has in mind. I mean, there's maritime domain awareness, and Hexet talked about this in some of his engagements. There's a US-ASEAN maritime exercise, but that really has been the most consistent pillar of US policy anyway. The safer front, I think we are seeing a little bit of change in terms of the administration's focus on scam centers. I think they are trying to get a few agreements concretely on the table and get a few commitments. To my mind, that's actually a good thing. If you look at the scam center issue, yes, a lot of it is housed in places like Southeast Asia, but it really is a global issue, right? Interpol's assessment is that I think it's over a third of countries globally are affected by these scam networks, right? So that's actually pretty significant. And then I would say the thing where there's a lot more questions about is the more prosperous front, right? There's a bunch of these trade and sectoral deals. And honestly, even though some countries entered into these deals early on, my sense, talking from Southeast Asian officials, is a number of countries were very cautious to not enter into these agreements first, including countries like Indonesia, because they wanted to see, they thought it was very unilateral. in its direction and nature. And they actually wanted to see if a country like Malaysia were to enter into this agreement, what would the domestic pushback be? And can Indonesia actually try to get some kind of agreement that is actually domestically more palatable for the audience? So it's going to be very difficult for particularly democracies where the polities are very interested in what the population is going to think about whether the country can stand up to the United States and also balance that in making a deal with the Trump administration. There's a lot of uncertainty there. And one final thing I'll just say, throughout Southeast Asia, I think I've been, in the last 6 months, traveled through about 8 of the 11 countries in the region. I do think that, in Southeast Asia, typically people will kind of play nice, and it looks like the optics are really good. The level of frustration and resentment with U.S. policy is very significant and not unlike anything I've seen in the past 20 years of looking at this region very closely. And I think you can see that from the public statements coming out of Singapore, which I don't think I've seen in Singapore's history. The sort of anti-US sort of, the US order is over, so on and so forth. And I think the Singaporeans think it's well-deserved because they signed a free trade agreement with the United States. At the time, the first and only country still to sign a full free trade agreement, and they still got a tariff imposed on them. So I think the Singaporeans, as usual, they'll recalibrate their policy and so on and so forth, but it is a good barometer and bellwether for the sort of quiet frustrations. And I think the other piece of that I would say is there's a reminder from some of these officials that, okay, we're talking about all these deals, but honestly, if you look at the legacy of the past US administrations, Obama talked a lot about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that went away. And then the Trump administration talked about all these deals, including with China. They didn't actually implement those, and now the administration is doing another one. The Biden administration came on, talked about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and we're not really talking about it anymore. So to the extent that the United States is expecting these countries to get on the bandwagon, is what we're talking about regarding US policy now actually going to be there when a future administration comes in? And that's going to affect, I think, a number of the calculations of these countries when they enter into these agreements, or decide to stay out and maybe wait it out and buy some US products, LNG, Boeing jets, and then some of it may be delivered, some of it may not. But it's not a strategic decision. It's a very tactical decision about accommodating the United States and diversifying partnerships.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. That's, I think, a really good introduction and a point at which we can probably hand over. Before we move on, I'm going to give you a free plug, Prashanth. Prashanth has a Substack called ASEAN Wonk, and if you want to follow these things in great detail, then I recommend that. Now, Anne-Marie, could we turn to you perhaps next? You're based at Seton Hall University in the US, but you're currently in Indonesia and travel often through the region. Prashanth talked a bit about frustration and resentment at US policy. I don't know if that's a good place for you to start, or explain some of that, or if you want to kind of give us your thoughts, and then we can come back to some of that in the next part.
I was actually writing down Prashanth's comments, and I was going to reinforce and echo them in my conclusion. So why don't I say that I fully agree with that, but actually I was tasked with looking at, key US relationships, bilateral relationships. And there's obviously 11 of them, and I was given about 5 minutes. So this is going to be a very cursory look. The first thing I want to say is that the tariffs are the big deal here. And the bulk of my presentation will focus on them, in part because A, it's a common challenge, B, these tariffs were decidedly unwelcome by Southeast Asia, in part because, as Prashanth notes, some countries like Singapore and others had deals that had been signed and they were just obviously not abided by. Then Southeast Asia, as we all know, is extremely trade dependent, highly integrated into global supply chains. So these tariffs have huge negative consequences. It has made life extremely difficult for every country in the region. Before turning to that, though, I do just want to briefly mention 2 countries where you have seen a relatively stable relationship. In the case of the Philippines, which Prashanth mentioned, the Philippines was the recipient of both Secretary of State Rubio's first phone call, Hegseth's first visit overseas, and Trump welcomed President Marcos' first state visit. So precisely because of the Philippines' geostrategic location close to Taiwan, key ally, it has gotten special attention. It has been exempted from cuts to military aid, et cetera, et cetera. So that relationship has not been as impacted by the tariffs. It is still, quote unquote, on course. And the second and unexpected relationship that has gotten better is Cambodia, which, in contrast to Thailand, welcomed Trump's so-called intervention in the Cambodian-Thai border conflict, where Trump, as some of you may know, threatened to impose extremely high tariffs on both countries if they did not cease fighting. So Cambodia has called for Trump to be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, giving him exactly what he wants. And it's used this opportunity to attempt to kind of shift bilateral ties away from the scam centers that Prashanth mentioned earlier that had been a huge source of conflict, as well as issues over whether Rinbase has been granted special access to China. And the two countries have also agreed to restore mill-to-mill ties. The Anchor Sentinel exercise that was suspended in 2017 will be restarted again. So we do see those two relationships kind of moving forward and getting better. But to the tariffs, because this is really the big thing. As we all know, on Liberation Day, Trump announced some of the world's highest tariffs on Southeast Asia, 49% on Cambodia, 46% Vietnam, 32% Indonesia, et cetera, et cetera. Besides these so-called specific tariffs, Trump also threatened what he calls transshipment tariffs on countries that he claims facilitate imports of Chinese goods to the US, something, of course, which has gone up as a result of the relocation of certain firms manufacturing from China to Vietnam in particular, and others in kind of a China plus one. Now, Trump urged the Southeast Asian states not to retaliate as China did. China urged Southeast Asian states to retaliate. So at the very beginning of these tariffs, you begin to see the pressure coming from both sides, which makes it much harder to hedge, right? So what we now see is that you're getting pressure, as I indicated, on both sides. China not only pressured them not to retaliate, also reminded them that they should not acquiesce to anything that sacrificed Chinese interests in these negotiations. So I just want to briefly talk about Vietnam and Indonesia. Vietnam, which has the third largest trade deficit with the US of about $124 billion, had been the target of significant economic coercion in the first Trump administration. It moved very quickly, and it moved very strategically in the Trump administration, right? It fast-tracked a, $1.5 billion golf course for the Trump administration, hotel project, caused a lot of problem with certain local actors there. It agreed to preferential market access for most US goods, manufactured, agricultural, purchase of Boeing jets, agreed to discuss lots of non-tariff barriers, a whole slew of concessions. Despite this, in the end, in August, when the US announced reductions in tariffs, Vietnam was slapped with a 20% tariff, which most of the other countries in the region, including those like Thailand, which had barely negotiated at all, got a lower tariff of 20%, or sorry, 19%, so slightly lower. So there was a feeling that they had gotten out, they had negotiated, they had done what they thought they needed to do, and in the end, they were not rewarded. If we look at the Indonesia case, Indonesia as well sent a mission, very high level, top trade negotiators to Washington, made significant concessions as well, agreed to purchase lots of US agricultural goods, even oil and gas, to remove many non-tariff barriers, etc., etc. Indonesia has not formally signed a trade deal. You can look on the US White House website to see what some of the issues are. But the toughest things in the negotiations are political clauses that the US has been demanding, which Indonesia views as bending the knee. What we saw when the trade agreement between Malaysia and the US was released at the during the ASEAN meetings was that Malaysia had agreed, and I might get the exact wording incorrect here, that it would agree to support US sanctions on third countries and not to do things that jeopardize essential US interests. This obviously caused a furor in Malaysia. Indonesia, non-aligned, staunchly nationalist, has been pushing back as the United States has demanded similar clauses in its agreement. Since the Malaysian agreement has been publicized, of course, this is now public, and this is going to make it much harder moving forward for the Indonesians to agree on any sort of deal, and these concessions or these demands from the US are going to be at the heart of it. So I just want to conclude there. We can talk more in the Q&A, but to this two questions or two issues that Charlie mentioned at the beginning, is the US viewed as a reliable partner? The answer is no. Is the US viewed as a source of support for countries' objectives? Again, the answer is no. And when you look at the tone that the US has adopted, go on the, White House website, look at its text about the negotiations with Indonesia or these other countries. It's framed in terms of zero-sum competition. This is a great win for the American people. And this zero-sum framing is grating on everybody. As my Indonesian friends say, there's supposed to be mutual benefit here. And they're not seeing that. They don't feel like it's being offered. And to conclude with Prashanth's point, there is deep frustration, there is deep resentment, and that is going to last regardless of how these negotiations come about and whether they are actually carried out.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Anne-Marie. I think that's a really good tour of the big picture. I have to say, of all the countries to have improved its relationship with the United States, I wouldn't have put Cambodia on the list, and especially after all the publicity about the naval base at Ream, which the Chinese seem to have access to. That's been one of the surprises. Elina, can we come to you now? And can you say how you think the region is reacting to it's only 10 months of Donald Trump. It feels like a lot longer, doesn't it? Second time round.
Well, I'm in agreement with a lot of what both Prashanth and Anne-Marie have said. I think I'll just drill down on some of the tech aspects of the relationship between the United States and some Southeast Asian countries. I will just very quickly respond to Anne-Marie's observation from her Indonesian colleagues about how these trade agreements are meant to be mutually beneficial. I think if you ask the Malaysian government right now that's on the defensive about the agreement on reciprocal tariffs, they'll say that the agreement was in fact mutually beneficial, although a lot of people will have a lot more to say about that. But anyway, on tech, let me maybe offer three comments. The first is that I think this, the way this event has been titled, Dynamism, is certainly one way of describing what we've encountered and experienced over the past 10 months. But I think the underlying premise of the tech relationship between the United States and ASEAN countries is what Anne-Marie has just emphasized, that it is one-sided and there is an emphasis from Washington that the US has to remain the dominant power in the tech landscape across the entire tech stack. What that means is that there has to be US primacy and leadership from the infrastructure level right through the software level and from platforms to even personnel. So that's the first point, that despite the illusion of investments, and there have been many huge investments of billions of dollars in Malaysia, in Thailand, and Indonesia by American companies like Microsoft, Google, and Amazon Web Services, the underlying premise is that these are essentially US tech companies and that they will therefore drive the American priority of retaining hegemony in the tech landscape. And this is not me just saying it, it is these US tech CEOs themselves aligning with the political ideologies of Washington, which is a marked departure from how it was under the first Trump administration. So as of this year, Silicon Valley and Washington are very, very closely aligned that there has to be US primacy in the tech environment. And you see this from the get-go, from the very first executive orders that were passed in January this year. There were 3 in quick succession that referred specifically to American leadership in various aspects of the digital environment. And these were passed, as I mentioned, at the end of January, but they continue through till February and onwards in various other presidential declarations, proclamations, and other executive orders. What is quite notable and that presages many of the provisions around anything digital in these trade agreements that we've seen in recent weeks is a fact sheet that was released in February this year, where President Trump mentioned specifically that the administration would consider, quote, responsive actions like tariffs to combat digital service taxes, fines, practices, and policies that foreign governments levy on US companies. And this, of course, has come true in the trade agreements that we've seen with Malaysia and Cambodia. So both of these countries will not be able to enact digital services taxes. Likewise, we expect for Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam, although those 3 agreements have yet to be released formally. The second point is that although this is meant to be, as I mentioned, mutually beneficial, or to borrow Anne-Marie's colleague's words from Indonesia, a lot of these statements have become policy, right? And this has been reflected primarily through trade policy, which might as well be Washington's foreign policy in Southeast Asia. And I think what we'll see is this continuing, because in fact, although we might think this is a new phenomenon, this goes back to the previous administration, President Biden's, but also I would argue at least 20 years prior. So what we're seeing is in fact not new. It's simply a more explicit and overt manifestation, articulation of muscular US foreign policy reflected in trade policy through technology. Let me give you an example. So under the Biden administration, or rather in the waning days of the Biden administration, the AI diffusion framework was released for public comment. Essentially, this AI diffusion framework divided the world into 3 groups of countries. The first group is countries, the usual suspects, allies, very close partners that would gain access to the most sophisticated of US technological offerings. The second category of countries would be essentially most of the world, but they would not be able to access the most sophisticated levels of US technology. And the last group of countries would be the countries that the US does not have friendly relations with, they would have zero access to US technology. And so this is essentially Washington dictating to the world what it could and could not get in terms of US technology. This very almost counterintuitively did not go down well with the US business and tech communities themselves. And so this was rescinded under the Trump administration. And what we have right now under the current administration in Washington is a more open AI framework. So the AI action plan under the Trump administration is ironically very open to open models. That said, though, there are restrictions, and it talks about US values. It still talks about anti-wokeness in US technology. And so there is almost a patchwork of different types of policies which seem to conflict with each other at times. But what the US realizes is that it has to compete with Chinese open AI models. And so it's decided to launch its own version of open models as an offering to the rest of the world, including Southeast Asia, of course. But it also, this AI action plan mentions very specifically that there has to be an AI stack that the US offers to countries around the world. And so, as I mentioned, this is almost paradoxical because on the one hand, there is this emphasis on openness. On the other hand, it almost advocates for countries to be locked into an AI stack by the US. The final point I'll make is that, as I mentioned, this pattern of US domination in the tech environment is not new. It goes back to 20 years and includes infrastructure like subsea cables. We've seen a lot of strong arming in recent years in Southeast Asia about decisions that countries like Vietnam should or should not make with regards to who they pick to supply the latest submarine cables to replace older ones, for example. And these cable decisions are no longer simply commercial decisions. They are essentially national security decisions by Washington, but also increasingly, because of this arm twisting behind the scenes, national security decisions that have to be made by Southeast Asian countries. There are master services agreements that lock in certain US tech companies to only US providers. And should certain Southeast Asian countries go with these providers, they will essentially be locked into this infrastructural agreement with the United States, along with this geopolitical alignment with Washington over the next 20 to 30 years. Let me pause here, and I look forward to the conversation that follows.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Elina. And at the beginning, I should have said that you're a senior fellow with the Asia program at the Carnegie Foundation, so that's great. I just wondered if I could pick up on something you said there. I mean, the implications of, the US trying to lock countries into the AI stacks and things. I mean, Bilahari Kausikan is one of many Southeast Asian diplomats who've said that the whole point of Southeast Asian foreign policies is not to choose. But it sounds like this is an attempt to force companies to make choices, dramatically. You go with the US ecosystem, we'll go with the China one. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, and I think if countries in Southeast Asia are not careful, they'll find themselves sleepwalking into a series of decisions that they think are tactical, but are essentially strategic.
And what, they might end up all going in the same direction, or that different bits of the state might go off in different directions, and at some point there's going to be a crisis further down the line?
Potentially. And so I think that's why it's really important for countries to have their eyes wide open and realize that these commercial decisions of the past are no longer simply commercial. So, for example, I mentioned this has been going on for decades now. There was a company called Global Crossings in the early 2000s that went bankrupt. And a Singapore telecommunications company decided to enter into a joint venture with a Hong Kong company to take over Global Crossing. That deal eventually fell through because of Washington's opposition to the Hong Kong company's presence location in China. But even when it was just STT taking over Global Crossing, it was subjected to great scrutiny. And there were all these conditions that were imposed on STT's takeover, including things like there having to be a national operations center that would have to be available for scrutiny and oversight within a 30-minute time frame by US personnel that had security clearances. And so you see various aspects of this replicated in deals like the TikTok deal. But also I expect that this will continue with other deals, including data centers and newer submarine cables in the region moving forward.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's clear that these emerging technologies are going to force a whole load of choices that are going to be much more dramatic than people are maybe expecting. Now, Anne-Marie, can I come back to you and maybe just keep a little bit with the trade agenda? I mean, ASEAN, 10, now 11 states with the shortly with the arrival of Timor-Leste, has created this trade agreement, RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. And that's led, I think, in the region to a sort of a much more integrated sort of supply chain network. And so does that just mean that sort of Southeast Asia has sort of just in that sense at that level has made a series of tactical choices that will become strategic because Chinese companies find it easier to kind of integrate Southeast Asia into their production systems and things, and that kind of has its own weight, regardless of what Washington tries to do as policy?
Well, my ASEAN friends would always remind me, number one, that RCEP was a ASEAN, in fact, an Indonesian initiative. And yes, you are correct. China is the dominant power, and China will be the one to make the most of much of that integration. I will say that ASEAN is also looking at RCEP as a bit of a strategic device, right? So there was an RCEP summit at the ASEAN meetings, heads of state, first time ever. Why? To push back to Trump, to show that there are alternatives out there and that these countries are integrating and doing things and they can't all be picked off right at the moment. You also, for the first time at ASEAN, had meetings of the ASEAN foreign and economic ministers, because now everything is geostrategic, geoeconomic. It's not just economics, it's not just politics. And they're trying to really, to Elina's point, ensure that the trade folks see the security folks and the security issues in both things. The other thing I will say, though, just in terms of, is Southeast Asia going in this inexorable direction with China is, yes, you do have RCEP, but you also have the CPTPP, and that's very different, right? The commitments under that agreement are much stronger than under RCEP. And so you have countries looking for diversification. You also have, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, everybody approaching the BRICS. Indonesia is now a formal member, Vietnam as well. And so this diversification that is happening away from the US and for their own purposes is really multifaceted. It's not just all a China story, although it often gets written that way.
Great, thank you. Prashanth, can I turn to you? I mean, as we're hearing here, there are, there's a security side, there's an economic side, there's an overlap between the two. Do you get a sense that Washington is thinking about this holistically, or there are different parts of the Trump administration, security hawks, economic nationalists, whatever, and they're all pursuing their own things? It doesn't quite join up in the middle. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a tough question because I think as both Elina and Anne-Marie have said, and I agree with this, I mean, there are some elements of continuity across different administrations. I think on the security side, for example, the sort of push on Taiwan to get a lot more granular in terms of what exactly would be needed for specific scenarios. I think that's a continuity that we're seeing across different administrations. I think at the same time, unfortunately for Southeast Asia, when you get to the real granularity of the Taiwan scenario, I think the conclusion that U.S. defense officials have reached, and this could be misplaced, is that really they only need the Philippines in an actual Taiwan scenario. And for the rest of Southeast Asia, it's going to be really difficult. And you can understand for the more hawkish individuals, they're looking at this from the perspective of even during one of the earthquakes in Nepal, the Thais were saying that they would allow access for the United States on an episodic basis. It would not be something that they would grant definitely sort of carte blanche, right? So I think if you go down the granularities, the big question for these Southeast Asian countries is if the administration is viewing it from a very narrow, safe, secure, more prosperous framework, absent a Taiwan scenario, absent scam networks, and absent narrow digital and sectoral deals in areas like critical minerals, for example, what is the value that these countries can offer? And I think different countries are answering that question in different ways. I think there was a sense earlier on from some Southeast Asian countries that buying Boeing jets and LNG and perhaps personal deals with the administration, including the family of President Trump, would be adequate to do so. I think that notion so far has been a little misplaced because I think there is a sense from this administration that learning from the lessons from the first administration, when it took them a long time to get these deals off, including the one with China, they ran out of time essentially to implement this and actually operationalize it. The fact that they now are paying a lot of attention to this, and before even the first year of the administration, we're seeing actual texts of agreements means that there's going to be a lot more focus on operationalization. Now, that said, I do want to flag a little bit that, as is often the case in US policy, it's very dangerous to assume that this is always going to be how it is when a new administration comes in, right? Just within the last week, we've seen the administration's tariff policies challenged in court. It doesn't look very promising on that front. My understanding is that the administration already has a plan B and even they say a plan C lined up, different sections in terms of how these tariffs can be implemented anyway, even if these legal rulings come through. So it might not actually matter. But I do think that there are some challenges that we are seeing in the policy ecosystem of the United States that are only coming to the fore, right? I think I would just caution, a few months ago, there was a sense that, okay, MAGA is sort of baked into the US policy ecosystem. We're not going back. The Democrats are in the wilderness. We heard the same thing about Republicans about a decade ago when Obama won his second term. And that proved to be extremely misplaced. And so I think we've seen some of the results come in some of the US elections, within the past few days, for example. So there are some checks, I think, on what the administration can do. I would also say on companies, my sense is, there is this trend in the United States of companies trying to, in recent years, accommodate the administration that's in office, but also increasingly, my sense is developing their own foreign policies too, right? Because they don't know how to prepare for a next administration that's sort of coming in. And so I think you're also seeing these companies sort of have their own sort of set of talking points, trying to develop their own vision for how they deal with a very uncertain US policy environment, where frankly, the populist wings of both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are basically gaining more traction. And that means that the sort of pro-business wings of both parties have been weakened substantially. So even if you have let's say, a Democratic administration in a few years, how do you deal with that as a company and as an organization? It used to be that some of these companies like Google and so on and so forth used to say, we're not American companies, we're global companies, right? But I think as Elina was illustrating in her point, there's a lot of pressure from the US government to say, well, if we're supporting you doing X, Y, and Z, you should be promoting U.S. national interest. I mean, you are and you should be operating as a U.S. firm. And so the challenges in the boardrooms, I think, are definitely quite significant. And it's very unclear where that's going to be. But I think it's much easier to sort of talk about the issues in terms of security deterrence in areas like Taiwan, South China Sea. Much more difficult to see how you compartmentalize on these big geoeconomic issues.
Great, thank you very much indeed. I think that's it's really kind of the difficult part for not just diplomats, but business people and all kinds of people involved in these connections. Just a reminder that if people want to type in a question, feel free to do so in the Q&A box. Anne-Marie, could I ask you? I mean, we've talked a lot about business, economics, tariffs, trade. What do you think are the other things that are kind of affecting views of the US in Southeast Asia, whether they be policymakers, elite levels, but also at sort of the level of general public opinion?
Questions I get most are about ICE, because that's what they see a lot on the news.
Immigration.
Immigration, what is perceived as an extremely militarized approach for obvious reasons, what is perceived as a very cruel approach, and what is perceived as a very, what's the right word? Ethnic, You have a lot of mostly white men when you can see the masks or beyond the masks on mostly colored people and, different shades. And in a country, and I'm just speaking here about Indonesia because that's where I've been for the, last period of time, that doesn't go down well. And that's the kind of big issue. The other big issue, of course, is Gaza and the whole Palestinian issue. People here are very torn. President Prabowo very much wants to enhance his ties with Trump. He wants to be a global figure. Obviously, getting closer to Trump is a means to that end. So, as you probably know, he has offered to send 20,000 Indonesian troops to Palestine. This is something that resonates well with the public in theory, but there are a lot of question marks, right? Indonesia has said they will only contribute troops to a UN traditional peacekeeping mission, not a peacemaking mission. What has been reported in the press about drafts that the Trump administration is considering sending to the UN is not for a blue helmet mission. It is for a international stabilization force, which will disarm Hamas, do a whole slew of other things, and will have some sort of cooperation with the IDF. So how does that work? You're not going to have a happy Indonesian public with their troops side by side with the Israeli Defense Forces in Gaza after all of the destruction that has happened. So things right now are kind of quiet on that area because there's not a lot to really talk about. How this plays out, obviously, Prabowo wants to use it as something to curry favor with the US. I think it could also very well blow up for obvious reasons.
Right. Elina, can I ask, do you have any thoughts on that? And also maybe because you look at sort of digital, economies, industries, how are social media, how is, influence of Facebook, TikTok, etc. Any thoughts on how that affects public opinion, views of the US and China in the region?
So on President Trump's visit to Malaysia, there was a huge debate about what sort of treatment and welcome Trump should be accorded. And that debate still rages on today, actually, because as we saw from the images, he had a glowing welcome. He seemed to have enjoyed himself. There was literally a song, several songs and dance. And he had a good time. And on the one hand, those in favor of how Prime Minister Anwar treated Trump, attributed that to just diplomacy. But there's a very strong sentiment on the ground that President Trump should not have been accorded the welcome that he had, and that it could all have been toned down. And this, of course, has spread onto social media. And that's why this sort of chatter lives on till today. And I think we're seeing a bit of that blowback right now vis-a-vis Prime Minister Anwar, but also with regards to the trade deal, which has only exacerbated sentiments on the ground. And so this feeling about the United States, on the one hand, it's very disjointed in a way, because there is an acknowledgement that the US investment is necessary, still continues to be necessary. And of course, the US remains the tech leader for now, at least. And that's why these huge investments by American companies, regardless of their political ideology and inclinations, are still very much welcome. On the other hand, the ground sentiment is quite decidedly anti-US, particularly in light of the genocide in Gaza over the past 2 years. And this disjuncture is probably going to pay in the domestic polls, depending on when Prime Minister Anwar calls elections. But for now, a lot of this debate is playing out, of course, on social media.
Mm. And a younger population that we used to think of as being sort of in favor of change, democracy, openness, and the West, are kind of rethinking, I guess, a lot of their opinions as a result of Gaza and what's happened. Yeah. Prashanth, I wonder if I could ask you, changing direction slightly. I mean, you've outlined the 3 priorities of the Trump administration, and they're very much homeland focused. I mean, in the old US, I mean, it tried to export good things, kind of freedom, democracy, that kind of thing. And Myanmar would have been a particular, kind of object of American policy in the effort to try and, bring democracy there and all the rest of it. And now we've got, the junta is entrenched, the civil war's getting worse, all the rest of it. Do you think the Trump administration has any idea what it might do? Does it even care about what happens in Myanmar? Does it want to bring about change there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, because I think we're sort of talking about, usually when you define the U.S. approach, the traditional way of kind of talking about it is kind of the DIME acronym, right? So the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. We're seeing a lot of attention on the military and economic aspects, but we actually are seeing not as much focus, but I would argue probably a decimation of some of the ecosystems that have traditionally been associated with the United States. The aid infrastructure has been totally annihilated. The media system, including Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, not only has been decimated, but actually some aspects of it, based on what we're hearing from the administration, might be inverted to focus on the enemy within, right? Which is the essential enemies of the administration in the US state. So that essentially, in the sort of framework of US-China competition, you are thinking about the PRC that uses a lot of its state media actually quite effectively. You'll come across stories in Southeast Asia and some random diplomatic meeting that would not be reported even by AP and some of these newswire agencies, but it would be picked up by Xinhua and sort of advertised in the Chinese state media. I think the Biden administration picked up on this quite significantly and started investing in US information architecture. But the Trump administration has closed a lot of that. And so I think in some parts of the US policy bureaucracy, I was having a conversation with an individual who was dealing a lot with the media disinformation conversation landscape. And they equated this as switching from bipolar competition with China to actually the United States committing part superpower suicide in the information realm. And so this is actually a very serious issue from that sort of landscape and perspective. And we're not going to see the manifestations of that in the next 4, 8, 10 years, but it does appear quite a significant challenge as it is now. Now, I'd say on Myanmar, we're seeing kind of the two ends of the extremes almost. I think we've heard when there was an earthquake in Myanmar, Secretary Rubio came out and said, yeah, a lot of people are asking why we should donate and have aid. If China and other countries want to come in and do it first, knock yourself out. I mean, that's a very different message than we heard from the United States under past administrations, where there was at least a rhetorical sense that the United States would try to compete or get some of its allies and partners to do more and so on and so forth. But then also we've seen sort of reports and concerns about transactional deals around sectors like critical minerals and rare earths, for example, in Myanmar. And if you talk to experts on rare earths and critical minerals, I mean, the big arguments they have among themselves is sometimes the big challenges that you see in the sector means that you probably should leave these things in the ground. They would actually create a lot less concern than when you actually dig them up, right? And so I think there's a lot of concern around the Myanmar issue, but at the same time, I will also say there are those who are maybe, I would say, a little bit overly enthusiastic about where the US approach could be. To going back to Anne-Marie's point about Thailand and Cambodia and the inroads that Cambodia has made that a lot of us would not have seen, right, a couple of years ago. There is a sense that perhaps if things got really bad in Myanmar, perhaps President Trump could see this as an opportunity for a Nobel Peace Prize and could get involved in the situation in ways that we have not seen any administration get involved in. And the Biden administration, actually, there's a lot of frustration in parts of Southeast Asia that the administration didn't really care enough about the situation. And so I think a little bit of, the Trump 2 is very different from Trump 1. But I think where there is a point of continuity is that some of the issues that have been neglected by previous administrations that you might be sleeping on might actually end up becoming really big issues. And similarly, some of the countries that you thought of as being insignificant might actually end up doing much better, right? Under Trump 1, for example, we saw the Obama administration actually, there were some tensions with Najib in Malaysia, tensions with Prayut in Thailand after the coup. Both of those leaders got White House visits under the Trump administration, right? So I think it's a good reminder also to sort of think about what might be some of the less likely scenarios that could come to play.
Yeah, if President Trump finds out that many of the people being attacked in Myanmar are Christians, who knows? We're quite close to time, but I just maybe some sum up comments from each of you, and maybe just how much you think Southeast Asian policymakers, governments think they have the power to change things. I mean, are they seeing themselves as sort of corks bobbing around in a storm on a stormy sea, or do they see themselves as having power, leverage either individually together? Can I maybe start, go with Elina and then go to Anne-Marie and then Prashanth finish up maybe?
I think going back to my earlier point, if you look at some of the statements coming out from the Malaysian government, it does seem as though they are under the illusion that Malaysia will continue to have agency. This, of course, has been critically disputed by large segments of the Malaysian population. But I think there is this sense amongst some, including I feel in Indonesia at the highest level, that there is some room to maneuver with this Trump administration. And I think that is actually quite risky to be deluded into that sense of comfort that this is Trump 1 that we're dealing with. And I mentioned this risk of sleepwalking into strategic realignment later on. And I am very concerned that that's what we're headed towards in Southeast Asia, because these series of what seem to be tactical decisions might ultimately come to be something much larger and more intractable to undo later on. We're already seeing elements of that happen with the agreements on reciprocal trade, for example. I would say that Cambodia has actually done better than Malaysia in some aspects of the trade agreements. So it's a patchwork of different levels of confidence and delusion, I think, in Southeast Asia. But the larger picture remains unclear for now, at least from my point of view.
Anne-Marie?
I agree with what Elina has said about both kind of fears of sleepwalking. Indonesia does believe that they have agency. However, they haven't quite figured out how to translate that into specific influence over outcomes. You have seen the president going everywhere, showing up at every meeting, joining new organizations like the BRICS. And the question then is, how has that delivered? And they're still trying to work that out. Obviously, a new president coming to power just before Trump. I do think that the one thing that we're not really looking at is kind of domestic politics. You know, on the one hand, just going back to kind of the tariffs on the trade, there is this, let's wait and see what the Supreme Court does. Let's not sign anything. The longer, the better. Put off these decisions, et cetera, et cetera. But these leaders are also under pressure from their own business people who want to make decisions, who are in this period of tremendous uncertainty. And so some are having debates of, do we sign a bad deal to get some certainty? And how bad do you go to get that certainty? And how much is all of that? And I think that's something that we don't always focus on enough.
Thank you. Prashanth, the last word, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just echoing what both Elina and Anne-Marie said. I think it's important to sort of distinguish between performative and substantive agency. I think we're, when we see countries saying they're going to join the BRICS, if there's a security situation, the BRICS is definitely not going to come to the security assistance of these countries. But I do think we are seeing some substantive areas of agency. They may not be significant, but I think they are things that are important to take seriously. I mean, Singapore just signed a green economy agreement. They've been kind of one of the champions of these sectoral agreements, moving the conversation away from aggregate free trade agreements. And I would say that's important not to sleep on, because the TPP actually came out from the P4 agreement that actually within Southeast Asia, Singapore and Brunei were originally part of. It's sort of seen as a US agreement, but actually it came from a sort of pathfinding initiative by smaller countries. And then I would just flag two other examples. One, I never thought that I would see the Indonesia-EU free trade agreement be actually signed in my lifetime. But the fact that it was done, I think signifies that the Indonesians are very serious about finding other partners geoeconomically. Now, whether that's going to translate into other partners, I can't say. But I think there is a seriousness in the region about looking for other partners. And that's not something that is rhetorical. It's something that's actually substantive. And then the final thing I would say is, important to look at agency, not just by national actors, but also local and subnational actors. And you're seeing this, Elina talked about the blowback that the Malaysian government is dealing with. Some of this is coming from the individual states who have sort of said, okay, you could sign whatever you want about critical minerals and rare earths, but hey, that's located in our states. You're going to have to actually work with us. And so this notion that I think all of us have flagged to some degree about blowback that these countries may get, not only abroad, but also within their own countries among specific domestic constituencies, governors, states, so on and so forth. That's a very serious proposition. And I think it's a notion of agency that we should also take very seriously.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Prashanth, and thanks to you, Anne-Marie, and to Elina. That's been a really good, insightful discussion by people who day-to-day work, research and output, social media and otherwise is very much connected to Southeast Asia. So I think that's a really expert review of what's going on at the moment.